There's a door in your life you've been pushing against for years. You don't think of it as a door. You think of it as a wall, a boundary, a fixed circumstance, the unmovable explanation for why a certain thing keeps staying just out of reach. The relationship you want, the work you're meant for, the version of yourself you can almost feel but somehow never become. You push, you strategize, you try harder, you wait for the right time, the right person, the right opening, and the wall holds. Eventually, you make peace with what every reasonable person around you has already made peace with. That this thing you want isn't going to happen for you, that it's not in the cards, that you should be grateful for what you have and stop reaching for what isn't yours. Carl Jung sat across from people who'd made exactly this kind of peace with their lives for 40 years of practice. And what he discovered about the wall they'd given up pushing against, the thing they'd quietly come to call impossible, changed everything he thought he knew about how human lives actually unfold. Because Jung discovered that the wall wasn't a wall, it was a door, and it had been a door the entire time. The reason it never opened wasn't that it was locked from the outside, it was that they'd been pushing in the wrong direction. Today I want to walk you through what Jung actually understood about this, because the popular version of it has been turned into something that misses the entire point. You've probably heard people talk about manifestation, about the law of attraction, about the universe delivering what you focus on. Jung would have looked at all of that and recognized it as a flattened, commercialized version of something far stranger and far more demanding than positive thinking has ever been willing to admit. What he actually discovered was that there's a precise psychological mechanism by which the things we call impossible become possible. It has almost nothing to do with belief or vision boards or wanting harder. It has to do with a particular kind of understanding so radical that almost no one is willing to attempt it. The people who do attempt it, who follow the path Jung mapped out across decades of his work, consistently report something they describe in nearly identical language. They describe what they thought was impossible beginning to manifest in ways they couldn't have engineered if they'd tried. To get there, we need to start with what Jung saw when he looked at people stuck against their walls. Because what he noticed first wasn't what anyone expected. Jung observed that the things his patients described as impossible always had a peculiar quality. They weren't random. They weren't distributed across their lives the way bad luck would be. They clustered in extremely specific places. The same person would have wild success in 3 domains and an immovable wall in 1. The wall would always be in the place that mattered most. The precise location where the deepest desire lived was almost always the place where reality refused to bend. This struck Jung as more than coincidence. If life were just neutral chance, the impossibilities would be scattered. They weren't scattered. They were targeted. They appeared at exactly the points where the person had the most invested, the most yearning, the most identification of themselves with the outcome. What Jung came to recognize, and what disturbed him because it implicated everyone, including himself, was that the wall wasn't being built by life. It was being built by the person standing in front of it, quietly, constantly, from a part of themselves they couldn't see. He called this part the unconscious, but the word has been so overused it's lost its teeth. What Jung actually meant was that there exists, in every human psyche, an entire counter-personality, a hidden self with its own agenda, its own beliefs, its own deep convictions about what should and shouldn't be allowed in your life. This hidden self is far more powerful than the conscious self that thinks it's running the show. The conscious self says, "I want this relationship to work." The unconscious self says, "Relationships like this one ended my mother's life, and I will not survive what survival actually requires." The conscious self pushes the door. The unconscious self holds it shut from the other side. And because both selves live inside the same person, the result looks, from the outside, like terrible luck. Like things just not working out. Like the universe being against you. It isn't the universe, it's you, fighting yourself with a force you can't perceive, in a battle whose existence you'd deny if anyone suggested it. This was Jung's first major recognition about the impossible, that almost all of it is internally generated rather than externally imposed. The wall is real. The source of the wall is inside the person who keeps walking into it. Most people, when they first encounter this idea, get stuck on a particular question. Why would I keep myself from what I want? It makes no sense. I want the thing. Every conscious part of me wants the thing. Why would some hidden region of my own psyche sabotage what I'm reaching for? Jung's answer was that the unconscious doesn't share your conscious values. It has older values, survival values, values shaped by experiences you may have forgotten or may never have been able to put into words in the first place. And from the unconscious's perspective, the thing you say you want is often the most dangerous thing it can imagine. If you grew up in a family where being seen meant being attacked, your unconscious learned that visibility equals annihilation. Now you, as an adult, say you want recognition. You want your work to be seen. You want to stop hiding. But every time you get close to actual visibility, something happens. You self-sabotage. You shrink at the moment of expansion. You find a way to stay small that looks, to your conscious mind, like bad luck or bad timing. The unconscious isn't doing this to hurt you. It's doing this to keep you alive. From its perspective, your conscious desire is a death wish, and it loves you enough to override what you say you want in order to protect what it believes you actually need. This is why pushing harder against the wall never works. The wall is being held in place by something that loves you, something that believes, with the unshakable certainty of childhood logic, that the wall is the only thing keeping you safe. Think about a woman who has spent 15 years saying she wants a partner who can actually love her. She's done the therapy, she's read the books, she knows the patterns. She can articulate in precise language exactly what kind of relationship she's looking for. And yet somehow, the people she's drawn to, the ones who make her chest tighten with that particular kind of recognition she's come to mistake for chemistry, are always, without exception, people who cannot give her what she says she wants. She knows this. She's noticed the pattern. She can list every relationship and predict, before the second date, exactly how it will end. And still, when she meets someone available, someone present, someone capable of intimacy, nothing happens. No spark, no pull. Her body refuses to want what her mind has decided it needs. If you were watching from the outside, you'd say she has terrible luck with men. You'd say the right one just hasn't come along yet. You'd say timing is hard, and the dating pool is brutal, and modern romance is impossible. Jung would say something else. He'd say she has an exact, internally consistent system that filters every potential partner through a single question. Is this person dangerous enough to feel familiar? The system works perfectly. It's never failed her. Every person who passes the filter is unavailable. Every person who doesn't pass the filter is invisible to her. The system is protecting her from the only thing she's ever truly feared, being loved by someone who could actually leave because she'd actually need them. The wall isn't romantic bad luck. The wall is a precise psychological mechanism, perfectly tuned, doing exactly what it was built to do. And no amount of pushing against it from the conscious mind will move it, because the conscious mind isn't where the wall lives. This is the first hard truth Jung's framework asks you to sit with. The thing you call impossible is not impossible. It's defended. The defense is internal, sophisticated, and running on logic you established before you were old enough to consent to it. What Jung discovered, as he sat with patient after patient circling the same walls, was that the unconscious wasn't just defending against danger, it was defending an identity. This was the part most people couldn't bear to see. The conscious self has built a story about itself, a story in which it is the one who wants things, and reality is the one who withholds them. The protagonist of the story is always reaching, always trying, always being thwarted. There's a kind of dignity in this position, a kind of nobility, the hero of your own narrative, who keeps trying despite the world refusing to give. What Jung kept finding was that this story was structurally necessary to the personality. The person didn't just have a wall in their life. They had organized their entire identity around having that wall. They were the woman who couldn't find love. They were the man whose talent went unrecognized. They were the soul who was meant for more, but never got the chance. The wall wasn't a frustration in their life. It was the central organizing fact of who they understood themselves to be. And if the wall came down, if the impossible thing became possible, they would lose the only self they knew how to be. This is what Jung meant when he said the unconscious has an investment in the wall. The wall isn't only protecting you from danger, it's protecting you from a version of yourself you've never met, a version of you that has the thing, a version of you that isn't reaching anymore, a version that would have to figure out who it is without the wall to define it against. Most people would rather keep the wall than become that stranger. They don't say this, they couldn't say this, but they live it. Every choice they make subtly reinforces the wall, because the wall is the only thing keeping the familiar self intact. Jung once watched a patient, a man who'd spent his entire adult life describing himself as someone who'd been denied the artistic career he was meant to have, receive, through an unexpected connection, the exact opportunity he'd claimed to want for 30 years. A real opportunity, resources, mentorship, audience, the door opening in a way that left almost no room for doubt about whether it was real. The man missed 3 meetings, forgot to respond to 2 emails, made a comment in the wrong room that ended the relationship before the project began. He told Jung weeks later that he must have unconscious fear of success. He said it almost proudly, as if naming the problem solved it. Jung wrote about this case for years afterward because it crystallized something he kept seeing. The man didn't have a fear of success. He had a love of his identity as someone who'd been denied success. Those are different things. Fear can be worked with. Identity defends itself with everything it has, because losing the identity feels like dying. And the man would rather miss every meeting for the rest of his life than become someone who actually had what he'd always claimed to want. If you've been pushing against something for years without it giving way, if you've started to wonder whether you're cursed, broken, or simply not meant for the thing you keep reaching for, there's something we put together for exactly this moment. It's called True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, built to help you see what's been holding the door shut from the inside. Not to push harder, to turn around. The link is below if that's where you are. But let's keep going, because the next layer of what Jung discovered is the one that changes everything. The reason the wall stays in place isn't only because the unconscious is afraid of what's behind it. It's because some part of you is in love with the role of being the one who can't have it. This is the shadow Jung spent so much of his life trying to help people see. The shadow isn't your dark side in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It's the part of you that has needs and motivations the conscious self would never claim. And one of the most common shadow patterns Jung documented was the secret payoff of perpetual longing. When you can't have the thing, you get to be the one who wants it. Being the one who wants something, purely, beautifully, longingly, is its own kind of position. You get the romance of yearning without the responsibility of having. You get the identity of seeker without the vulnerability of finder. You get to be eternally on the way somewhere you'll never have to arrive. This sounds harsh. It might even make you angry to read. But Jung was unflinching about it because he'd watched too many people refuse to see it and remain stuck for decades. The shadow benefits from the impossibility. The wall serves it. And until the conscious self is willing to admit that some part of itself is collaborating with the wall, no amount of effort will move it. The collaboration is invisible because it doesn't feel like collaboration. It feels like trying. It feels like wanting. It feels like reaching. Underneath the reaching, though, there's a precise calibration. You reach with exactly enough effort to feel that you tried. You aim with exactly enough imprecision to ensure you miss. You commit with exactly enough hesitation to give yourself an out. The conscious mind interprets all of this as bad luck or bad timing or external interference. The shadow knows it for what it is, a beautifully orchestrated performance of wanting, designed to keep the wanting alive forever. Jung observed that the moment someone could see this in themselves, really see it without flinching, without justifying, without immediately turning it into another reason to feel bad about themselves, the wall began to move. Not because they pushed harder, because they finally stopped pushing. This is where Jung's framework gets strange. strange in a way that sounds almost mystical, even though it's grounded in observable psychological mechanics that he documented case after case. When you actually understand, really understand, not intellectually grasp, that the impossible thing in your life is being held in place by your own internal collaboration with its impossibility, something happens that no one can adequately explain in advance. The collaboration loses its power. You can't decide your way out of an unconscious pattern. The conscious mind doesn't have that authority over the unconscious. Understanding, though, full, embodied, no longer deniable understanding, operates differently. It's not a decision, it's a recognition. And recognition has a specific effect on unconscious material that Jung documented across decades of his work. The effect is dissolution, something like a hidden mechanism becoming visible, and in becoming visible, ceasing to function the way it used to. Jung compared this to a magic trick. When you don't know how the trick is done, it's genuinely impossible. The coin really does disappear. The card really does change. As long as the mechanism stays hidden, the impossibility is real to your experience. The moment you see how the trick works, the impossibility evaporates. Reality didn't change. Your relationship to the mechanism changed. You can no longer be fooled by it because you can no longer unsee what you've seen. This is what Jung meant by understanding in the deepest sense. He wasn't talking about intellectual comprehension. He was talking about the moment when the trick stops working on you because you've finally seen behind the curtain of your own psyche. Once that happens, once you've actually seen what's been holding the door shut, the door doesn't necessarily fly open. Things in life don't move that quickly, but your pushing changes, your reaching changes. The whole quality of your relationship to the thing you want shifts because you're no longer fighting an invisible opponent. You're working with a known mechanism. Known mechanisms can be negotiated with. This is the precise point at which what Jung's patients began describing as the impossible becoming possible actually started happening for them. The wall came down not because they pushed harder. The wall came down because they finally turned around and asked who was building it. What Jung saw in people who completed this turn, and it's worth being precise about what completion looks like, was a particular shift in how they moved through their lives. They weren't suddenly luckier. Their circumstances didn't immediately transform, but their relationship to their own agency changed in ways that produced, over time, results that genuinely looked impossible from the outside. They stopped attracting the same patterns of people. The repeating dynamic ended, not because they got better at screening, but because the unconscious filter that had been doing the selecting was no longer running invisibly. They could feel themselves being pulled toward the familiar wall and recognize the pull for what it was, and the recognition itself created enough space for a different choice to emerge. They stopped collapsing at the threshold of their own success. The pattern of getting close and then mysteriously self-sabotaging began to interrupt itself, because the part of them that was sabotaging had been brought into conscious awareness. It didn't disappear, but it could no longer act in the dark. And acting in the light is the one thing that kind of unconscious resistance cannot do effectively. They stopped describing certain things as impossible. The word itself fell out of their internal vocabulary, not because they'd adopted some positive thinking ideology, but because they'd seen, from the inside, how impossibility actually gets manufactured. Once you've seen the manufacturing process, you can't fully believe in the product anymore. What replaced impossible wasn't certainty. It wasn't optimism. It was something Jung found harder to name, but recognized whenever he saw it. A kind of patient curiosity about how the door might actually open. A willingness to notice that the pushing wasn't working, without taking the pushing as evidence of the door's permanence. A capacity to sit with the question of what their own resistance might still be doing, without needing to demand an immediate answer. This is the state from which the impossible becomes possible. Not because the person has manifested it, because they've stopped doing the unconscious work of making it impossible. There's a subtlety here that's worth pausing on, because it's the place where most people who encounter Jung's framework go wrong. The conscious mind will try to weaponize this understanding. It will turn the recognition of unconscious resistance into another strategy, another technique, another method for breaking down the wall. The moment it does that, the recognition stops working, because you've made it into more pushing. You've just relocated the push to a more sophisticated target. Now you're pushing against your own unconscious instead of pushing against the wall. And the unconscious responds to that push the same way the wall did. It digs in deeper. It defends harder. It generates more elegant explanations for why the impossible is impossible. What Jung was actually pointing toward was something stranger and more demanding than any technique. He was pointing toward a relationship with your own psyche in which you stop being the one who wants and the one being denied, and become, instead, the one who's curious about why this particular pattern is happening in you. The one who's interested in what your unconscious is protecting. The one who can sit with the question of why a part of you might be invested in the impossibility, without rushing to make that part go away. This relationship, Jung called it the dialogue with the unconscious, though the word dialogue undersells how strange the conversation is what actually moves walls. The walls aren't built by the unconscious to harm you. They're built to communicate something. They're a language. The moment you start listening to what they're saying instead of trying to demolish them, the relationship between what you want and what you have begins to shift in ways that, from the outside, look exactly like the impossible becoming possible. There's a man Jung wrote about toward the end of his career, anonymized in his case notes, who came to him at 52 convinced his life was over. He'd spent 3 decades trying to do work that mattered to him, 3 decades of false starts, near misses, projects that almost happened and then mysteriously fell apart at the final stage. He arrived at Jung's office having decided he was simply not destined for what he wanted and was looking for help accepting his fate with some dignity. Jung didn't help him accept his fate. He asked him a question instead. He asked him what his father had thought about people who succeeded at the kind of work he'd been trying to do. The man went quiet for a long time. He finally said his father had thought such people were arrogant, selfish, disconnected from the real lives of working people. His father had been a working-class man who'd carried a lifelong grudge against what he considered the pretension of the educated class, the class his son had been trying for 30 years to join. Jung asked one more question. He asked whether the man could imagine his father being proud of him if he finally succeeded. The man laughed sharply and then began to cry. He said his father had been dead for 11 years, and he still couldn't picture it. He couldn't picture his father being proud. He could only picture his father turning away, refusing to look, considering him lost to the other side. That was the wall. Not external, not circumstantial. The wall was a 30-year contract he'd made with his dead father, that he would keep failing, just barely, just often enough, so that he could remain his father's son. Success would have been a betrayal. Every almost success had been a love letter. The man didn't transform overnight. Jung was honest about that. But within 18 months of that conversation, the work he'd been trying to do for 30 years began, quietly, to happen. A project he'd been circling came together. A collaboration he'd been afraid to ask for materialized. The door, which had seemed permanently locked, turned out to have been a door all along, held shut by a man who loved his father more than he loved his own life. That's what Jung meant when he said understanding changes everything. The man hadn't manifested anything. He'd seen something. And what he'd seen could not be unseen, and the unconscious contract could no longer hold in the light of what had been revealed about it. This is the territory Jung is pointing at when he talks about understanding. It's not the kind of understanding that comes from reading a book or watching a video, including this one. It's the kind that arrives when you finally turn around and look at the part of yourself that's been holding the door shut, and you see, really see, what it's been protecting, what it's been afraid of, what it would lose if the impossible became possible. The strange thing Jung kept observing was that this seeing wasn't punishment. It wasn't an indictment of the unconscious for sabotaging you. The unconscious had reasons. It always has reasons. And when you finally meet it with curiosity instead of force, when you ask it what it's been trying to keep you safe from instead of demanding that it get out of your way, something in the relationship shifts. The unconscious isn't your enemy. It never was. It's the part of you that absorbed information you couldn't process at the time and has been holding that information for decades, waiting for someone to come ask about it. The conscious self, when it finally does come asking, isn't there to destroy what it finds. It's there to receive it, to take responsibility for it, to bring into the adult life what the child had no way of integrating. That's the dialogue Jung was pointing toward. That's the relationship that moves walls, not the conscious self conquering the unconscious, not the unconscious being forced into submission. Something more like reconciliation, something more like two parts of one person finally being able to talk to each other after a lifetime of speaking different languages and assuming the other one was the problem. When that conversation begins to happen, and Jung was clear that it begins, that it doesn't happen all at once, that it unfolds over months and years of patient attention, the things you've been calling impossible start losing their impossibility, not because you forced them, because the internal opposition that was generating the impossibility no longer has a reason to oppose. Its reasons have been heard, its fears have been met, its protection is no longer needed in the way it once was. The door you've been pushing has been waiting for you to stop pushing long enough to notice it opens the other way. That's the whole secret Jung was trying to point at. The wall is a door. The door opens inward, and inward in this case means toward the part of yourself you've spent your whole life trying not to meet. If you can meet that part, not fight it, not transcend it, not push it away, but actually meet it, what you've been calling impossible will begin to manifest in your life. Not because you commanded it, because the internal opposition that's been blocking it will quietly, gradually, almost without your noticing, lose its reason to keep blocking. This is what Jung understood. This is what he spent his life trying to help other people understand. The framework can be summarized in a sentence, but the sentence is misleading because it makes the work sound simple. It isn't simple. It's the most demanding thing a human being can attempt. To stop being the protagonist of your own struggle long enough to become curious about who's writing the struggle into existence. But the people who attempt it, the people who manage to turn around and look, the people who finally meet the part of themselves they've been running from for decades, those people consistently report something Jung found impossible to argue with, regardless of his own scientific skepticism about anything that sounded mystical. They report that their lives began to organize themselves around possibilities they couldn't have imagined from inside the wall. A relationship would appear in a context that had been barren. A piece of work would find its audience after years of being invisible. A version of themselves they thought they'd lost would reemerge, not as performance, but as something they could finally feel from the inside. The impossible would, with quiet undeniability, manifest. Jung never claimed this was magic. He claimed it was psychology. He claimed there were specific mechanisms by which unconscious resistance shapes external reality, and that those mechanisms became reversible the moment they were brought into consciousness. The mystical-sounding outcome was the natural consequence of a mechanical change, the removal of an invisible force that had been actively producing the impossibility, day after day, for as long as the person had been alive. If you've made it this far into this video, some part of you is already starting to recognize what he was pointing at. The wall in your life that you've been pushing against, the thing you've decided is impossible, the future that seems reserved for everyone but you. There's a reason it stayed in that exact location. There's a reason the pushing hasn't worked, and the reason isn't that you haven't pushed hard enough. The reason is that the wall has been a door the whole time, and you've been pushing it in the only direction it cannot open. The direction it does open is the one you've been most afraid to look in, inward, toward the part of yourself you've been trying not to meet, toward the contract you may have signed before you were old enough to know you were signing, toward the identity you've built around the wall, and what that identity will have to release if the wall finally comes down. This is the work Jung's framework points to. It's slow, it's strange, it's unlike anything the manifestation industry has tried to sell you, and it produces, in the people who undertake it seriously, exactly the result the manifestation industry promised and could never deliver. The impossible begins to manifest, not because you've commanded reality, because you've finally stopped commanding yourself to stay small. If you're ready to start that work, the work of turning around and finally meeting what's been holding your door shut. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, is built for exactly this stretch of the path. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's framework, designed to help you see who's been building the wall and what they've been trying to protect. Not techniques for pushing harder. A way to begin the dialogue Jung said was the only thing that ever really moved walls. The link is right below.